Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, everyone, welcome once again. Today we're going to hear about Gore Vidal's autobiography from, I think, 1965 to current. And our reviewer, Kane, I got to tell you something, one thing about him. We set this up about, 6 weeks ago or so, or 2 months. And Ari comes in the library a lot. And the last 2 months, every time I've seen him, he's had a different Gore Vidal book in his hand. And I'm saying, Ari, you don't have to read his whole canon of works. You got to just, talk about this book. But I think he got really enthralled with all this stuff, so he's going to tell us about it. So Ari is the editor emeritus of the Journal of Gender Studies. He's a gerontologist. Teaches senior college courses or something like that.
Well, I teach programs on keeping the senior mind active.
Keeping the senior mind active, okay. And he's also the editor of a new book that's out, Crossing Sexual Boundaries, Transgender Journeys, Uncharted Paths. And so here's Ari to tell us about the Gore Vidal book, Point-to-Point Navigation.
Thank you very much, Joe, and welcome to what I hope will be a stimulating half hour or 45 minutes or whatever time we decide to devote to discussion. Gore Vidal comes into my life, not personally, but vicariously with the introduction of Myra Breckenridge. If you recall, that was one of those pulp books. And he was writing for Hollywood film productions in those days. And they asked him to do a book, I guess, related to sex and gender and a variety of things. And he concocted this idea of a transsexual who was getting revenge for having to give up her masculinity or maleness and then come back in spades and want to deal with all the people who were bad in her life, like her father and her mother and all the other people. It's really a low book in the structure of all the works that Mr. Vidal has done. By the way, you can all hear me, is that right? Is that right, Rosalind? You can hear me? I'm not being stentorian because I'm not in the amphitheater, but if I were, I would certainly be speaking with a louder tone. We have a microphone here that helps, and I will, from time to time, be reading from the book. And when I read, my volume tends to fluctuate. So if anybody can't hear me, please feel free to do so. Let me begin by a few factoids about Mr. Vidal. And for that, I need my glasses. This book is probably the last of his work. I'm pretty sure, unless he is called upon to write the annals of Mr. Bush, the chances are pretty slim that he is now retired from the literary scene with the occasional appearance as a senior elder statesman, if you will. He's a provocative American iconoclast whose prose style is a good example of what I call graceful clarity. When you read anything of Mr. Vidal, and I read his first major novel, as well as some of the other works that I will allude to later, and in each of them, the man has got uniqueness in his writing. And at least I have found the images that he creates are really quite astounding. And as you read more and more of him, you really become addicted. This man is an extraordinary person in America. He was never dull and wrote in several major genres. Historical novels. One of the librarians here, who will remain nameless, gave me several other books by Gore. And one of them was a historical novel on Lincoln. And at first I said, why do I want to read a historical novel about Lincoln? especially from a writer who's not a historian, which I find out later that Mr. Vidal is quite a historian, and if not, he's a historiographer. He's one of those people that searches out the person that he's writing about. And he had a research team to do this book on Lincoln, which I was amazed at. But as I started reading this thing, I could not put it down. And it's a book, I'll show it to you later, about this thick. And the printing was just about my speed because, as you get older, you want larger print, and paperbacks don't work for me anymore. So that was the first introduction to the historical novels that Mr. Vidal has written. There are several of them, and I'll allude to them later. But on essays, on satire, as a screenwriter, playwright, politician, and polemicist, this man has made unique contributions. He's in the 9th decade of his life. He was born 10/3/25. His parents, the mom was known as Nina Gore Vidal, and she was the daughter of Senator T.P. Gore, who was from Oklahoma in the early part of the 20th century. And he's the only Oklahoman, as Gore says, who never made millions of dollars off the oil business. But he was blind. And one of the pluses, as well as probably one of the burdens at some point, was the fact that Senator Gore, relied on his grandson to read many of the books that were in his library. And so Gore became a prolific reader and also a purveyor of ideas from the earliest parts of, recorded time. And that reflects in a lot of his thinking and his work. And I'll allude to that in this book. His mother was, I don't know what to describe her as. He described her as a vamp, interested in social climbing and also people with males who had a lot of money. And she did well by that, but her life was filled with discontent and burdened with alcoholic problems and other kinds of problems that I guess some women have in periods of the 20th century. So he really didn't see much of his mother, except that she was always involved with the man who was going to help educate her son, because the original father, whose name was Jean Vidal, had very little to do with his intellectual development, at least, but was in fact related to the Vidal who was very active at West Point. And Jean Vidal, which is his father's name, was the pioneer who taught aviation dynamics to the first of the pilots that were going to be in our Air Force back in the 30s. Interesting character, and Gore says a lot about his mother and father in the first of his memoirs, known as Palimpsest. By the way, how many people have read anything by Gore Vidal? Is this like a new author in your life? No, good. I'm glad to know that he's not a foreigner. I don't think I want to dwell too much on all of the subtlety of their lives and how they impacted on Gore's own life. But needless to say, they were major factors in what he writes, how he thinks, and his attitudes about life, liberty, and the pursuit of. In this book, he focuses on a lot of the things that he talked about in the first memoir, but here he's coming clean with some of the subtleties that he couldn't publish 40 years ago, 1995 when he did the first, and what happened in the ensuing years. And there are pieces in this that I think I'd like to read if people are interested, about some of these areas, particularly his involvement in politics, both in the Upper Hudson Valley, which is our area, just south of the Catskills, and in California. The other thing about this book that's interesting, he relies on one of the great French philosophers known as Montaigne, who had thoughts about aging and wrote about them. And so every so often in the preamble to one of these very small chapters, he talks about Montaigne would say this, or Montaigne relates to this, and I will cite one of those passages. The memoirs here are short, so they're no more than 2, maybe 3 pages. They move on. There are 52 so-called chapters. I call them chapters, but there are 52 different topics in which he dwells from his memory. Now, he even admits that as he's gotten older, he wrote this in 2004 and 5. He lost his partner, I think, in 2005. In any event, the focus is on the latter 40 years of his life, and the style, I think, is conversational. That is, he conveys the experiences in the kind of, let me tell you a story kind of thing, and I was at this place, or once upon a time kind of thing, not quite as storybookish or fairy tale-ish, but in that same genre, so that you don't get bogged down with his really superb intellect and his sensitivity. Also, I think one of the things that's so nice about Mr. Vidal, and he doesn't mince words with it, is his honesty and willingness to tell and share his truths. He's a big thing about people who are inveterate liars, and many of the people in his life were so-called inveterate liars. So he tries to avoid that, and he's assiduous in saying that I cannot abide people who are liars. And almost everybody in the world lies at some point in their lives. And the moral of the story is those who lie too much have no sense of reality. Mr. Vidal spends a little time talking about that, and one of the things I'm going to quote. Now, what I've done, and I'm going to stop for a minute if there are any questions about the overview, and I thought what I would do is recite what I call the headings to the chapters, because he does not put headings on these chapters, just chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., up to 56. Now, what I've done is read these, and then I've reread some of them. Some of them I think are worth hearing aloud. We can't do the whole book, obviously. And what I'd like to do is read what I call the titles. And then we'll ask for a sort of a show of hands of the ones that you think might be of interest. So if you have a piece of paper nearby, and you can remember all these 56 whatevers, I will recite them. The first one that I think is useful is political involvement. The second is about Pope John Paul and the Roman Catholic Church. The third about his grandfather. His grandmother was named Dot, so he used to call his grandfather Da. Now, Da, Da, Dot. That's the Morse code. So Da was Grandpa, and Dot was Grandma. And he talks a little bit about the influence of his grandfather on his life. And then he, early in the book, talks about the presidential election of 2004, has some things to say about his dad and aviation, and Amelia Earhart, of which he had made acquaintance before she took her trip around the world and never came back. He lived in a house that was one of those great relics of the 19th century, about maybe a quarter of a mile off the Hudson River, down, I'm not sure of the town, but the name of the house was called Edgewater House. It was a great, beautiful mansion that needed gobs of work. You know about houses. Most of you people have owned houses. And he bought the house for a very low price because nobody wanted to buy it. And then he spent the rest of 25 years fixing it up. And there were lots of things he shares about that in the first book, Palimpsest, the first of his memoirs. But in this one, he has a few extra anecdotes, and I might want to share a few of those with you. And then he talks about a speech that he gave in Boston in 1975, I think 75 or 69, I can't remember, at the Arlington Street Church, which is a well-known Unitarian Universalist church in the Boston area. And it was about homosexuality. And In the audience was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts. And at the end of the talk, he came up with a copy of a book that he wanted him autographed. Well, some reporter picked up on this fact and besmirched the name of the judge, as if it was a crime for somebody who was in public office to come to a lecture by a well-known personality and talk about a subject that's rather taboo. So I thought that would be worth sharing because it clarifies in many ways our misperceptions of homosexuality, same-sex love, and what we call today gay life. And he never uses the word gay in all of his writings because he probably was kind of what's the word? He's kind of pensive about his relationships either with men or with women. And the relationships with women were not sexual relationships, but they were very deep and meaningful. And you see that early in his life when he talks about The City and the Pillar in his first novel. The return to America from Italy to Hollywood. Gore was very successful in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And at some point in 63, he and his partner decided it was time to leave the United States and relocate somewhere else. And he went to Rome. Rome is a wonderful city for expatriate Americans. There are lots of them there. They come for all kinds of reasons, and you get an interaction dynamics that are very different. Well, after 2 or 3 years, I guess, in Rome, they decided they wanted to live further south where life was a little more tranquil in some places and featured the beauty of what I call the Italian coast. So they finally located a town that was just south of Mount Vesuvius called Ravello. And Ravello is a little hill town along the Amalfi Drive, and they built their house. They didn't buy it. They didn't build it, but they bought the house called Rarandinaya. That's what they called it. And a lot of his time was spent there writing some of the great things that he did write about. I lived in Rome for 5 years, so I had a feeling that when I talks about Italy and Rome, I can relate closely to some of the experiences that he had. Not all, but some. I mentioned the business of Montaigne, and in one of the chapters he talks about Magna Graecia and the statements that relate to Montaigne. Reminiscence about becoming 80 years old. A note on the first Vidal memoir. Somebody actually wrote a critique of his work, and a fellow from, where was it? Australia, named Dennis Altman. And in one of the chapters here, he talks about some of the mistakes that Dennis Altman made about this person and how the quality of the research that he did was questionable, particularly since he was an Australian and not really a true blue American. And the charge of being anti-Semitic, which is one of the things that a lot of people seem to remember being thrown at Mr. Vidal, I'd like to make sure that what he says here is clarified. And the last bit is on the Kennedy assassination. And Gore had some strange relationships with the Kennedys and with Jackie Onassis. Jackie was the daughter of the woman who married Hugh Auchincloss. And Auchincloss was an heir from the Standard Oil fortunes, and his mother, Gore's mother, married Huey, they call him Udi, before this woman who was Jackie's mother married Hugh Auchincloss. So there's this sort of half-brother, half-sister relationship, which in the 60s and in the 50s was worked with a little bit. And Gore talks about an experience that they had while they were at the compound in the Kennedys and how that unfolds. And I had some experience with Robert Kennedy in the late 60s. So I could relate to some of the things he's talking about here. And at the same time, I have no way of knowing for sure that this was a major influence on what happened to the Kennedy clan. So those are the topics that I thought would be useful. And if you just want to let me know right now. I will go to that section. I marked off all the sections in this book to be sure that I could get to it. So are there any particular ones that hit anybody's fancy at the moment? Yes, ma'am.
2004 election.
Okay. This is chapter 31. I'm not going to read all of it, just enough to give you a sense of how incensed he was about the 2004 election. 2 days ago, politics intruded as it has a habit of doing in this bad time. Yes, all times are bad, but some times are worse than others. This is one for our country. A Michigan congressman, John Conyers, minority, that is, a Democrat, leader of the House Judiciary Committee, went to Ohio with several other members of Congress and a number of staffers to determine whether or not, in the late presidential election of 2004, the overexuberant local Republican Party had stolen the election for George W. Bush. The result was a report by Conyers, which a Chicago firm published with a preface by me. Yes, Virginia, the election was well and truly stolen, and the Conyers team spells it all out in considerable detail. Since the Republican Congress would not allow hearings on what went wrong, Conyers had no recourse other than a book describing in detail how the theft was effected, with collusion among high officials and shadowy executives of the electronic voting machine companies. Since my name as writer of the preface is on the cover, radio stations with call-in facilities have been ringing me from Arizona to Ohio to Illinois to Texas to, in a few hours from now, New York City. Most of the callers proved to be already suspicious of the election's validity, but as they have been given no information by our monolithic media, the Conyers report is the first hard news from the front. And he goes on here, and I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I think you could do that. But at the end, he's got something to say here. Our old original republic does seem to be well and truly gone. A day or two ago, I witnessed the Republican majority of the House Judiciary Committee trash the Democratic minority, which ironically actually represents many more Americans, millions of Americans, than do the majority congressional members who represent what Secretary of State William Seward liked to call the mosquito republics, whose departure in 1860 he quite welcomed, unlike Lincoln, the mystical Unitarian who chose civil war to keep them attached. So that's something that you might want to follow through on. He has a reference in it here, but you can find that book somewhere in the library if you look for it. It's the Conyers Report. Another topic, yes, ma'am.
The second one about the Pope.
Oh, yes. Here we are. In Rome, I usually found the Jesuits not only congenial but often wise. Not long after Karol Wojtyla, Archbishop of Krakow, was raised by the Holy Spirit to the See of Peter as John Paul II, the Jesuits were ready with a joke. The new Pope addresses God. Almighty, will there be a married clergy in my time? No, my son, not in your time. Almighty, will there be women priests in my time? No, my son, not in your time. Almighty, will there be a Polish Pope? And God bellows, not in my time. The Jesuits had done their homework. All the potential reform that had come out of Vatican II was sternly undone by the 14th century Prince Bishop from Poland, primarily interested in, like Pius XI before him, in papal authority based on the most literal, illiberal readings of Scripture. The result has been a serious shortage of priests in the United States, with ever fewer would-be priests on the horizon, while the parishioners pick and choose which of the Pope's commands to obey and which to ignore. Meanwhile, Brazil's huge Catholic majority is splintering off into strange Protestant evangelical groups. By watching the crowds in St. Peter's Square night after night was for me a nostalgic trip in time. I first set foot in the piazza in the summer of 1939. The heat was Washingtonian. The Pope was then Pius XII, now generally thought to have been too accepting of the Hitler regime. Later years, when Howard and I, Howard is his partner, were living in Rome's Villa Giulia, Pius XII, real name Pacilli, finally died. Apparently he was something of a faddist when it came to medicine. The ultimate fad proved to be his embalmment by what seemed to have been an amateur taxidermist. As a result, while he lay in state in the basilica, he turned, according to one viewer, emerald green. Then, in response to the summer heat, he suddenly exploded. This was kept from the world for a long time until someone heard, a Jesuit, passed on the information. It is also reported that many sturdy Swiss guardsmen fainted during this holy combustion. See the sense of humor, irony. It's really wonderful to read this kind of stuff. You feel good that you're not alone in the world with the craziness out there. Although an absolute non-believer, I saw the church as a fascinating shadow of imperial Rome, with its curia so like the Roman Senate, whose building is still pretty much intact in the Forum. And here I would agree with him, because when I lived in Rome, I was connected, even though I was teaching in a secular place, I was connected with the American College of Rome, and most of the people training to be the future bishops and priests back in the States. So I had some good insight into some of the things, and one of the fellows was an incredible guy from a place up here, I think called Plattsburgh, right? Plattsburgh. And Clarence was an extraordinary scholar. And so he took me around to many of the sites which no one ever sees in Italy if they get out of Rome even. But I went on the tour of the gardens of the Vatican, and the gardens of the Vatican are a unique experience of what was the great fountain craze in the time of Pope Julian. And they'd been all these beautiful fountains which adorned most of the city of Rome. But in it, there was so much of the history of the 14th century and the 13th century popes. And as I went to each of the other monasteries and other areas of some note in remote parts of Italy, I was amazed at how this church was built on all the previous churches that have been in Rome, including Mithra and the early church of the polytheists and what the Romans would call pagans. So I would concur that a lot of the polity governing the Vatican and Rome is a carbon copy from the old Roman Curia. Another section that someone, yes?
Kennedy assassination.
Oh, golly. Okay, how many people would like to hear that one? Okay. Well, we'll find out. Actually, it's 54 and 55, chapters 54 and 55. I'm going to read the 55 part because it all has to do with irony. And here, Gore is masterful in how he describes this. This was not just a plot to kill a president, but this was a plot of almost decades of the father's involvement with the mafia in the 30s, in the 20s, and how the sons who were carbon copies of father in some ways would repeat the same kinds of ententes and détentes, with the exception that the people who Dad was so enamored of, or I wouldn't say in cahoots with, were rubbing Robert Kennedy the wrong way. And so I shall read this thing, and then you can form your own opinions on whether this is close or not. I shall now borrow Publishers Weekly's nice précis of this long, highly detailed book, which states that Gerald Posner's polemic, Case Closed, this was the book about the Kennedy assassination, took the CIA's lack of involvement for granted, and that, according to this mammoth and painstakingly researched account, was a big mistake. It is Waldron and Hartman's contention, bolstered by access to many previously unavailable files and interviews with little known as well as prominent figures, that the CIA knew a great deal about the assassination. But the agency could not admit what it knew because that could uncover the existence of a U.S. plan for a coup in Cuba, run by JFK's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The assassination, says the authors, was carried out by hired gunmen on the orders of 3 noted mafia dons whose lives were being made miserable by RFK's ruthless pursuit. And these mafia men knew about planned invasion because they had worked with the CIA on previous efforts to topple Castro. Oswald, long a hidden CIA agent, was set up as the patsy, and it had always been Jack Ruby's job to eliminate him if he wasn't killed at the scene of the Kennedy shooting. How do the authors make their case? With relentless accumulation of detail, a very thorough knowledge of every political and forensic detail, and the broad perspective of historians rather than assassination theorists. Ultimate Sacrifice describes how the Kennedy C-Day plan was penetrated by 3 mafia godfathers, Carlos Marcello, Santo Traficante, and Gianni Rosselli. All 3 were being vigorously pursued by Robert Kennedy, along with a dozen of their associates, of whom 6 were working on the Castro murder case. The crime bosses then used parts of the C-Plan, aka AM World, to arrange JFK's assassination in a way that would prevent a thorough government investigation in order to protect the coup plan, its participants, as well as, naturally, national security by invoking the secrecy surrounding the C-Plan. The mob bosses targeted JFK twice before Dallas. Once in Chicago on November 2nd, JFK called off the motorcade, so the plan was scuttled. And the second time was in Tampa, and he survived unscathed at that particular attempt. I didn't hear about any of that on November 18th. Ultimate Sacrifice reveals and details why Robert Kennedy later told several close associates the name of the godfather, Carlos Marcello, who had ordered his brother killed. But he couldn't do anything about it for fear the Soviets might go to war. Irony in tragic action. I recall when, over the years, I'd been asked why what happened at Dallas happened, I'd answer because Bobby had broken a truce made with the mob by Joe Kennedy in 1960. Bobby, glory-seeking, broke it by hounding Teamster boss Hoffa and going after the mob bosses, and I mentioned those names. When a dog bothers you, you don't cut off its tail. That's what Marcello, this is one of the mafia bosses, said. Thus, it was the murder of JFK, ordered and carried out by the same team that his brother was assembling to murder Castro and prepare the way for the invasion of Cuba, at the request of a Kennedy Select Provisional Government. This is classic irony and on the bloodiest scale. Had word leaked out the Soviets, in order to avenge Castro, might have used its nuclear-tipped missiles against some 50 U.S. cities. Hence the use of Oswald as a patsy and his murder by a fellow CIA agent, Jack Ruby. The transcript of Ruby's later quizzing by a clueless Chief Justice, Earl Warren, is worthy of that non-Ionist Samuel Beckett. Anybody want to respond to that? Anyone feel that what Mr. Vidal says here has a kernel of truth? Is it disbelief? Of course, it's now, what, 40 years? Or is it 50? No, 63? About 50 years since the assassination. Does anybody remember where they were at that point in their lives? We go on, you see, and even though these are tragedies that have happened in our lifetime, that's why I think Gore Vidal is so important, because he doesn't necessarily forget some of the things, and he knows how to articulate them in a way that doesn't just call for anger. He's not, in this book at least, he's not angry with people anymore. He's stopped being angry. And even when people call him various names, like an anti-Semite or anything of that nature, he has no quarrel with any of that. He knows they're wrong, and he will not defend himself, but I think offer what he considers to be misinterpretation of the facts that happen to cause these kind of blemishes on his literary and social career. Are there any other prose chapters from this that, yes, ma'am?
I'm interested in the Amelia Earhart.
Okay. You know, they had a thing about Amelia Earhart on the public television. That was a rerun some years ago, and Gore's father was very active with all of that sort of stuff. He was a pioneer aviator, and while he didn't create the machines, he learned how to fly them. He was, you know, fanatic about it. Back in the 1917, after the First World War, aviation was really a hot thing for young men, more so than cars. Let me see if I can find where that is here. 162. Okay. Those who flew in the early years of the 20th century were unlike, in many ways, those who did not. Of course, most did not live any great age. They crashed. My youth was filled with family friends wearing neck braces. There were also many premature funerals. My own father was one of the original Army Air Corps pilots, trained in 1917. He married the daughter of Senator Gore of Oklahoma and became the first instructor in aeronautics at West Point, where I was born in the cadet hospital. Bored with peacetime Army life, he helped found 2 small airlines, and these became ultimately TWA and Eastern Airlines. In the mid-30s, he and his friend Amelia Earhart started Northeast Airlines in conjunction with the Boston and Maine Railroad. When Amelia was lost somewhere in the Pacific, my father, who had been director of Air Commerce under FDR, was put by the president in charge of the search. FDR was almost as fond of her as he was his wife, Eleanor. A great cloud of conspiracy theories have since surrounded Amelia's disappearance. 30 years after her disappearance, I asked Mrs. Roosevelt whether there was any truth to the stories that Amelia, her friend, had been sent to spy on the Japanese preparations for war in the Pacific, and that they had either shot her down or she crash-landed and was made captive. The veins in Mrs. Roosevelt's left temple often throbbed when she was suddenly moved by emotion. Recollected, when the war ended, she said, I made my own small investigation. As you might suspect, I harassed everyone connected with the flight and the search. Certainly there was nothing of the spying nature about her flight. She simply lost her way and was trying to find where it was, Howland Island. And there's a few other tidbits about it. But Amelia was not in the 20th century fully. She didn't like any of the radio stuff. She didn't want to have radar on her plane. Too much weight, you know, that sort of stuff. And that probably was part of the reason that she was lost and couldn't find Howland Island. Any other of these chapters that you would like to hear about? Yes, please.
The House on the Hudson.
House on the Hudson, okay. This is a little bit lengthy. Of course, he repeats some of this stuff, but there's a picture of it here, as well as some real wonderful stories. On one visit to Alice, when he lived in New York State, or in New York City, he made friends with a lot of the hoi polloi in the suburbs north of New York City. And of course, Rhinebeck was one of them, and there was a person there, Alice, I don't know if that's Alice Longworth Roosevelt, no, Alice Pleyel Bouveret. Anyway, a lot of those people lived in these mansions up north of New York City. On one visit to Alice's house, she took us for a drive through the countryside to see a beautiful Greek Revival house built in 1820 with columns and an octagonal library, the work of A.J. Davis, a lawn extending from the portico down to the Hudson River. There was also 3 acres of willow and locust trees, as well as a small island in the river. My television work paid barely for the house, some $16,000. $16,000 for this house. On the other hand, I had no money to furnish the place. Alice allowed me the use of some furniture intended for the London house that she was never to live in. She died far too soon in 1956. Howard and I continued to live on at Edgewater until the 1960s, when the books seemed to have moved all on their own to Italy, and so we moved with them until now. As I write, they are headed for California, where I shall finally live in the 4th and final house, whose endless library seems to have been assembled by the sorcerer's apprentice. Howard and I lived in Edgewater for 20 years, then sold it to a rich businessman who collected Greek Revival houses, which he usually made museums out of, and then gave to the public, enjoying, no doubt, a considerable tax deduction from a grateful nation. I've only set foot in the house once since the sale. It is now a sort of museum of the 19th century furniture. He said, and he goes on to talk about his dreams of the house, what it meant for him. And it was here that he launched his political career, when he tried to unseat the Republican member of Congress for these 5 counties, Dutchess, Columbia, Greene, and whatever the Hudson counties. Again, he's not an overly nostalgic guy, but every so often you get this real historical pang. Are there any other chapters that someone would like to hear about? If not, yes, ma'am.
This isn't a chapter, but a question. Is that house still extant in a museum?
As far as I know, I haven't been down there. I had intentions of going down there just to verify that this was the house that's in the picture. But if it was made into a historic landmark, my assumption is that it's still standing. I would like to end my talk then with the business about Montagna and Magna Graecia. 232. We are. This is chapter 47 of the book. Have I got enough time, Joe? Yeah. Okay. Opposite my desk as I write, 2 pieces of parchment testify that I am an honorary citizen of Ravello, as well as of Los Angeles, and my favorite award, a hammered silver plaque from the cities of Magna Graecia for creation. That was one of his books. And my contribution to the classical world. I haven't read that one, but I'd probably put it on my list. I think the award was presented in Crotone, where Pythagoras died. Certainly his cult still haunts the coast, which I shall soon be leaving for a more satisfactory world, yet again. As I look about my study, I see a row of books bound in dark blue leather. Something annoys me. I open Montaigne's essay on in the Screech translation. My source of annoyance is there, but where? Why? The book falls open automatically at his essay on lying, which I often reread when faced with the excess of lies in our public life. Lying is an accursed vice. It's only our words which bind us together and make us human. If we realize the horror and weight of lying, we would see that it's more worthy of the stake than any other crime. I find that people normally waste time quite inappropriately punishing children for innocent misdemeanors, tormenting them for thoughtless actions which lead nowhere and leave no trace. It seems to me that the only faults which we should vigorously attack as soon as they arise and start to develop are lying and, a little below that, stubbornness. Those faults grow up with the children. Once let the tongue acquire the habit of lying, and it is astonishing how impossible it is to make it give it up. If a lie like truth has only one face, we could be on better terms, for certainty would be the reverse of what the liar said. But the reverse side of truth has 100,000 shapes and no defined limits. The Pythagoreans make good to be the definite and finite. Evil they make indefinite and infinite. This is all from Montaigne. A clumsy journalist at Time magazine some years ago did a cover story on me which was odd. It was the time of Nixon's fall, since the piece was about my novel 1876 and some of the not always sterling truths that our founders were capable of. The essay on me was entitled The Sins of Our Founders, which was capable of, a standard propagandist erasure of the news, and the publishers did not want to take seriously, sometimes known as they all do it, so what's the fuss? Currently, to counteract all the talk of stolen elections in 2000 and 2004, a dozen journalists now assure us that our elections have always been corrupt, which is hardly true. Recently, the same Time magazine journalist felt it was time that I be discredited as vain and self-absorbed. So he wrote as if he had actually been inside my study, which he hasn't, and saw hundreds of blue leather-bound books, all by me. But they are mostly worn leather-bound reference books of the sort, I doubt, that this journalist consults. But then, more than ever in my lifetime, the great whopping lie is in serious vogue. And so I leave you with the challenge as well as the enjoyment of reading one of the great writers of this country, born at a time of great turmoil, but the country's always been in great turmoil. And some of his statements, some of his contributions, and we can't fault him for examining the values in his life and responding by writing about them. Thank you very much. Question?
I'd like to ask you that, since you really are a historian at heart, if you could talk with him today, who would he say was his favorite founding fathers? Was it Jefferson? Was it Hamilton? I
have a feeling that Vidal would not put any of those people on pedestals. I look at the history that he's written about Aaron Burr and the importance of how having Alexander Hamilton killed and the legacy of Hamilton in our culture. I mean, Hamilton's work is the work of the Federalists, and it's that basis upon which a lot of the 19th century political structure was founded. And but Hamilton was the son of some Caribbean woman who was considered to be a bastard and so forth, and was never accorded the great acclaim that other people like Sam Adams, who was very politically and also very bright as a legal person. So I would say that Hamilton comes close because he was an independent spirit, had some very clear ideas about economy, and could offer a political groundwork for making this country work. You know, it's still working. And you read Lincoln, the country was totally despondent. I mean, when you read this book by Gore on Lincoln, you wonder how this ever took place. And apparently we have a 100-year history of having to reinvent the principles upon which the country is founded. And that's the importance of teaching. If we don't at least air these wonderful experiences that have happened in the past, the younger generations will never know the trials and tribulations that have to keep happening so that we can preserve the value of being human. That's what I think Gore Vidal is trying to clarify. And his life is just one of many. But he's examined some of the values in his life. And I'm reminded of one of my own epithets, an unexamined life has little meaning. And so in that sense, I'm one with Gore on at least examining some of the values in his life. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Okay. Okay.
Would you comment on the title of this book? What is it? Is it a metaphor? Is it
Point to point, this thing?
the title of the book that you just...
Yeah, the title is Point to Point Navigation. And let me read you what he says about this. In World War II, I served as a first mate of an Army freight supply ship based in the Aleutian Islands, where the weather was so bad that we seldom saw the sun, much less the moon, and stars. This made it impossible, nearly impossible, to use the compass to chart a course. Instead, we relied on maps where we had memorized various points or landmarks as guides, a process known as point-to-point navigation. Process with obvious dangers. We had no radar. As I was writing this account of my life and time since palimpsest, I felt as if I were again dealing with those capes and rocks in the Bering Sea that we had to navigate so often with a compass made inoperable by weather. So this is a metaphor of that experience. Thank you all.